I saw
my
her
gosh,
before
is
my
that
mind
really
could make
you?
sense of it.
It's been ages.
A
How have you
slant of
been?
gray and
I
hair
can't
I
believe we're all
remembered as
back here
black,
again.
the same quick,
Seriously,
precise
stop
way
looking
she
at me like
tucked a
that.
loose strand behind her ear,
I can't
the
help it. You look
narrowness at her
wonderful.
jaw that had always made her face look as if it could hold a secret and a smile at the same time. The room was a shallow bowl of light and bodies. String lights haloing the high school gym turned reunion. The smell of cheap coffee being drowned out by people catching up as if time were a skein to be plucked and knotted back together. My chest tightened in a way that did not feel like panic or pleasure exactly. It felt like recognition in muscles and not in thought. She was not alone. That was the other immediate seismic fact. A woman beside her, hand threaded through her elbow like a sentence completed. They were laughing at something the photographer said. Sophie, I later learned, held that laugh with the steady openness of someone who had been practiced at warmth for years. The flash popped, a collective freeze-frame moment, and the photographer said, "Okay, everybody, reunion smile." Which is when time shortened. We were all in a portrait with our histories like props at our feet. I do not remember how I ended up at the edge of the group, probably drifted, as people do in rooms full of borrowed minutes. But I found myself next to her when the photographer said, "One more." Her hand brushed mine as we angled together for the camera. It was a contact no younger me would have survived without crying. My fingers fit in the hollow of her palm, the same way they had at 16, except my knuckles had fine lines now, and there was a faint scar above her eyebrow I had never noticed in pictures before. The camera clicked, and the light was brief and bright, and for a second, I could not breathe through the image of her hair and the curve of her shoulder. The small intimacies of two people who had been more than a second in a different life. I stepped back as if the room had suddenly become too loud. People were clapping and talking. Someone called my name. It sounded foreign in my own ears, and I left the throng without really deciding to. I told myself I needed air, and that was true. Mostly I needed space to remember how to be myself in a world that had suddenly been asked to blur the edges of its careful maps. Outside, the air was sharp, cold against the warm gym light on my face. Cars hummed by, and in between that sound, I could still hear the echo of her laugh, as if it had lodged somewhere behind my ribs. I was checking my phone like it might tether me back to ordinary life. Emails, the small necessities of a consultant's travel schedule, when I heard my name again. Softer. The voice that had once known every inflection of my jokes without needing the punchline. Maya. She took a step closer, and for a beat I felt like a younger version of myself. The one who would have smiled and fumbled and told her something foolish about the weather. She looked younger and older at once. Adoption of little hands on the steering wheel gestures, a professional steadiness that filled out her posture. For a moment, I wanted to catalog differences like proof that time had indeed marched on and changed things. "Chloe," I said. The name landed like a small stone thrown into a pond, rings on the surface, then everything tilting. She looked apologetic in that way that felt like a practiced expression. "I did not realize you were here. I flew in," I said. It was sparse, measured. Something about the way she answered cut through the absence of years, like a line in a song I thought I did not remember. "You did," she said. "I heard. I am so glad you came." The conversation that followed was not the scene in a movie where two adults pick up seamlessly where they left off. There were halting moments, little silences like mislaid furniture. People passed and greeted, and the reunion's noise folded around us. She introduced me to Sophie properly then, and the introduction was as gentle as putting a ring of keys on a table. "Maya, this is Sophie. Sophie, this is Maya." Sophie's handshake was firm and slightly nervous, a competent, attentive kind of kindness. There was no hostility, no claim laid like a fence, just two people meeting in the steady, unflashy way long relationships meet newcomers with measured curiosity. We said we would find each other the next morning for coffee. I said yes before my brain could list reasons not to. That she had a partner. That there were decades and careers and cities between us. That people in our 40s build lives designed to be inconvenient to pull apart. There was a part of me that watched my own mouth and oscillated between disbelief and a kind of fierce, childish hope. She gave me a small, tentative smile and said, "Please," which is a simple verb but heavy with things unsaid. Before she left the courtyard, she leaned in and with the same careful attention she had always given to details, touched my cheek briefly. No words, just a palm for a second. I should have catalogued that as a line I should not cross. Instead, I considered it the tiniest map back into feeling. We both walked away with our separate lives and with history folded like a letter in our pockets. If you like slow burn stories with complicated real women, subscribe. There are more like this. The coffee the next morning was in a shop that looked like someone had curated nostalgia out of brick and chipped mugs. It was warm and smelled like vanilla and bad decisions, which felt accurate enough for my mood. We sat across from each other at a table by the window, and something in the way the light struck her profile made me feel like the years could simply be held between us and smoothed. So Chloe said, with the kind of therapist softness she had clearly learned in graduate school, not intrusive, not prying, merely holding a place for words to arrive. "Tell me about now. Where are you? What is your life like?" I told her in elliptical sentences because that is what you do when your life has become a series of projects and hotels and other people's calendars. Consultant, full schedule, New York apartment that felt mine and not mine in equal parts. A recent polite end to a 5-year relationship with someone named Jessica. Practical reasons, misaligned priorities, the sort of thing you arrange like a moving van. Boxes, legalities, a calendar penciled in. I did not tell her the part I rarely admitted to myself. I had never stopped carrying around a small, thudding sense that something had been left unfinished. Like a book you close without finding out whether the protagonist finally finds what she needed. She listened the way people trained to hold pain do, with eyes that tracked each sentence and a little intake of breath after certain names. Then she told me about being a therapist. She said she had been in private practice for the better part of a decade, that she loved the work because she loved noticing people, their sudden revelations, and their stubbornness. She said Sophie was her partner. They had been together nearly 8 years. There was a small, shared apartment full of plants and books, a stability she described without apology. When she mentioned Sophie, I noticed a shift in her voice, something like a catch on a guitar string. "Sophie is," she began and hesitated. It was the first honest pause where the past pressed itself into the present. "She is steady," she finished. "She keeps me balanced in ways I did not know I needed. She is also the person who has been there for me through job changes and mundane life stuff. She is good." The admission came like a protective gesture. She was not listing Sophie as an obstacle. She was naming her as a real person with tender qualities, which made what came next more complicated than a plot device. "I left when we were young," Chloe said. "I left because I got scared, and I am sorry. I wish I could have had the courage then to be honest about why I left." I told her I had been a mess after that. She listened. Then she said softly, "I thought about you often. At night, some names visit. Yours did." The way she said it made me feel seen and simultaneously suspicious. Old patterns have a way of asking you to lean into them like a familiar chair. We spoke for hours if time could be measured in the territory between sentences. She apologized for the way she had disappeared and called it cowardice and fear at different times. She also explained plainly what had kept her. It was not an attempt to excuse herself so much as a map of why she had turned away. She mentioned clinic hours, new clients, the difficulty of establishing trust with people who had put their histories in your hands. She spoke about the ethical weight of leaving a practice midstream, of referral lists and supervision, and I could hear the gears of logistics clicking in her head. She was a person who thought through consequences like a moral checklist, and it made her harder to love without reservations. When she said she had been in a relationship with Sophie for years, the way she said it was like acknowledging a fact out loud. This is an adult life with roots, she did not say, but as if Sophie were a punctuation, because she would not. She said everything with the care of someone trying not to make anyone a villain. There was a moment in the coffee shop when the conversation ran out of words and simply became a geography of gestures. She folded her hands around a mug, and I watched the light move across her knuckles. For the first time since the gym, we were two grown women sharing a table without the theater of other people's memories between us. The smallness of the scene, a chipped saucer, yet a laugh that escaped and was then caught, felt like a miraculous attempt at ordinariness. "Are you seeing someone now?" she asked finally. "I am not," I admitted. "Jessica and I have been separate for a few months. We were practical about it. There was no drama." "It is," I shrugged. "It was work, and not the kind that makes people say pretty things." She nodded. There was compassion in the nod and in the way her eyes softened. "I want to be honest," she said. "Not necessarily because I expect anything, but because you deserve to know. I have not been honest with myself for a long time, and I am tired of that." She reached across the table and hesitated for a heartbeat before placing her hand over mine. It was a small, tentative pressure, not the kind that coaxes, but the kind that asks permission. "Is it okay if I do this?" she asked. "Yes," I said without thinking. Saying it felt like an answer to a question I had not realized I was asking myself for 20 years. We agreed in that careful way adults make decisions to try seeing each other without promises. One day at a time, she said it felt like a mantra and also a hedge against catastrophe. We said goodbyes that felt longer than the distance between the table and the door. She walked me to the edge of the block, and then she did something remarkably reckless. She asked if she could come to my hotel that night. I found myself laughing at how sudden it felt, but inside it landed with the weight of inevitability. "I need to see you," she said. "Tonight, if that is okay." That night at the beige hotel off the interstate, I felt like someone waiting for the tide. I told myself I would not let history dictate present choices. And I told myself to be cautious and pragmatic. But when she arrived, hair pulled back into a messy bun in the same sweater she had worn in the coffee shop, eyes swollen with a handful of tears she had not yet named, I found those defenses crumbling in a way that felt both alarming and relieving. We stood in my room without any pretense of small talk. She closed the door softly behind her and leaned against it as if to steady herself. For a moment, we simply looked at each other. Two people in their 40s who had both aged and remained startlingly the same. "You do not have to do anything tonight that you do not want to." She said she was the first. And I realized then that she had been the cautious one all along, not reckless. Seriously, anything. "I know," I said. "I do not want anyone to be hurt either, Chloe." The words came out careful. The phrase a kind of umbrella I held over both of us. I do not want to cause harm. I do not either. She sat on the edge of the bed and folded her hands. That is why I needed to be honest with you. I could not keep ghosting the past and then pretending it did not exist. We talked. It is strange how grown-up conversations can sound like adolescent rehearsals. I did not stop thinking about you, she said, but not in the way that would have made sense when we were younger. It felt more like a thread. I said something like, I never stopped knowing where you were, which was true in the way memories can be geography. I could plot where she used to live by the coffee shop she favored, the bent lamppost she liked to stand under, the playlist she used to make. Hours passed and the night grew intimate, not because of any theatrical gesture, but through the accumulation of small confessions and admissions. She told me she had stayed in Chicago because it was where her work was rooted, and because Sophie's family was there, and because she valued the kind of safety that comes from shared routines. She also said, with no need to romanticize or vilify anyone, that safety had sometimes felt like a choice that prevented her from living honestly. She used the word afraid, and then after a pause, admitted, I am still afraid sometimes, but not of the same things. At one point, she put her hand on my knee and said, May I? It was the slowest, most adult seduction, a conversation about consent that made me both laugh and ache. Yes, I said. The kiss that followed was a careful thing, a sealing of two people who had spent a long time being separate, and now wanted to see what the seam would look like stitched together. We stopped and checked in with each other, literally and metaphorically, more times than felt necessary. Are you sure? She asked between breaths. Is this really safe? It is as safe as two people who are not willing to hurt anyone can be? I said, and she nodded, like that answered the question for both of us. We were not reckless. We were not naive. We were in our own rendered way trying to be ethical within a messy human situation. We fell asleep in the same bed, hands intertwined like two vines that had finally found a trellis. I thought about how often I had imagined this moment, and how little the imagining prepared me for the texture of it, the warmth of her shoulder under my palm, the slight hitch she made in her breathing as she slept, the soft click of a lamp as the city outside continued its indifferent hum. In the dark, I tried to draw a map forward and kept finding tributaries that led nowhere certain. The next morning broke with its own quiet. We made coffee in the tiny hotel kettle and spoke in the hushed, practical tones of adults dealing with fallout. I have to tell her, Chloe said at breakfast, and the sentence was a small, bright fish on the surface of the water. I will not make decisions for her. She deserves to hear it from me. I am not asking you to be someone you are not, I said. But I do not want this to be something sneaky. I want honesty. She nodded. I know. I do not want to be the kind of person who leaves a trail like an eraser under ink. There are things to plan, clients to transfer, a lease to think about, conversations with partners. The ethics of it made her pause. She kept returning in that early morning clarity to the practical obligations she owed not just to Sophie, but to the people in her care. Something about the way she listed those obligations made me trust her more. We committed vaguely and then more specifically to a timeline. She would be honest with Sophie that day. She would not disappear again. She would give Sophie the courtesy of a conversation, and then they would see how they both wanted to proceed. She spoke of client lists, of referral names she would call, the professional necessity of a 30-day notice for some practices, the 10-day buffers for high-risk clients who needed careful handoffs. It was administrative in a way that was reassuring. She was not romanticizing escape. She was accounting for the consequences, Then it happened in the kitchen of Chloe and Sophie's life, the phone call. She called Sophie in the parking lot of the hotel because it was the only place she thought she could speak without noise. When Sophie answered, there was a pause that reverberated. Sophie's voice was steady. "Hey," she said. "Everything okay? Can we talk?" "I need to be honest," Chloe said. The phrase was both tremor and anchor. "I need to tell you something important. There is no magic way to write a breakup that does not hurt. You can only control your own language, the tenderness of your cadence, the readiness to accept the outcomes." Chloe did not dodge that. She spoke with staccato courage, small sentences that tried to be both kind and precise. She told Sophie she had seen someone from her past and that it had reopened a complexity she could not shirk. She told Sophie that she was not certain what the future held, only that hiding this felt like a different kind of betrayal. There was silence on the other end for a long time, and then a voice that gathered itself to ask a question that needed asking. "Are you leaving me?" It was a simple question, and Chloe's answer was a climb. She said, "I do not have all the answers right now," which was truthful. She said, "I owe you honesty," which was necessary, and she said quietly, "I am sorry." Sophie cried briefly. It was terrible and ordinary, the sound of someone who believed in the life they had built being asked to reckon with change. I could hear Sophie's hurt in each syllable. Not monstrous, not performative, just deeply human. She said, "I thought we were okay." It was the most terrifying sentence anyone had spoken that day. Chloe did not try to explain away her pain. She listened. She also offered practical gestures. She would call their landlord. She would offer to stay in a spare hotel if the air in the apartment became too thick. She would arrange for Sophie's sister, Olivia, to come if Sophie wanted support. It was not enough to erase the wound. It was the attempt to do what adults do when they recognize they have caused pain. To take responsibility in the smallest, most concrete ways. Later, when Chloe hung up, she held the phone a little too tight. Her hand shook. She said, "I told her she was hurt rightfully." She turned away for a moment, and I watched her struggle with the unavoidable fact of having inflicted pain. "I did not want to do this like some impulsive movie," she said. "I wanted to be honest, and I wanted to give her the respect of hearing it from me." "I have never wanted you to be thoughtless," I said, "and I do not want to be the cause of a person's heartbreak, even if it is the consequence of your honesty." She looked at me, and there was a quality of grief in her expression that made me feel both guilty and protective. "I have to go back," she said finally, "to handle the practical things. Clients, the lease, everything. I cannot just uproot without doing the right work." She listed the things on a breath. Referral lists, session notes, the secure transfer of records, the need to find coverage for certain clients. She sounded in that litany like someone who meant to be responsible. "I will come back," she added, as if that would anchor us both. She left that day on a plan that was messy and bureaucratic, a schedule of calls and notices, and a tentative return 2 weeks later to wrap up her private practice and negotiate a leasing timeline. She promised to give Sophie space while still being present enough to answer questions. It was not a dramatic, cinematic exit. It was paper and appointments and small, careful acts. The week after the conversation felt like suspended breath. We texted and FaceTimed in the intervals between her client sessions and my slide presentations and late-night debriefs. She called me in the middle of a supervision handoff to ask about a detail of an email draft, and I could hear through the lapses in sound quality the cadence of someone trying to hold 2 lives steady at once. We said things like, "How are you?" And then more real and small, "Did you eat?" As if nourishment was a tether to the world we were remaking. Sophie's presence hovered in those conversations in the way ghosts do. Always felt and rarely seen clearly. Chloe spoke about the breakup as something she had initiated but not completed the moral ledger for. She admitted guilt with a frankness that sometimes made me ache. Guilt for the way she had hurt someone she cared about. Guilt for the confusion she had caused Sophie's family. Guilt for the ethical tightrope of abandoning a life that had been built in mutual trust. She did not try to minimize these things, which is what made her decision when it came seem less like a caprice and more like a deeply considered though imperfect choice. On the phone one evening, she said, "There are clients who depend on me, Maya. I cannot leave them in the lurch. Some of them need a careful handoff. I am arranging that. I am offering referrals and a few months of transitional coverage. It is not simple." She sounded tired, which was honest. I could hear the toll of responsibility in her voice. If I am going to start over somewhere else, I want to do it without fracturing other people's lives. "That feels right," I said, "and it makes me trust you." She laughed, a small, distracted sound. "We are building trust via group texts and therapy referrals. How romantic." The complexity of it all made me feel old and young at the same time. Old because life had developed these knotty moral problems. Young because the heart behind them still pulsed with the reckless hope of longing. There were nights when doubt coiled in my stomach, and mornings when the optimism of a new cup of coffee carried me like a small flag. Then one late evening, after a day of client transitions and emails and a conversation with her supervisor about the feasibility of relocating her practice, I got a message, a photo of an airplane wing, and a one-line text. I told her, "I am on a plane now. I am coming for 2 weeks." My phone buzzed again with a voicemail, and when I pressed play, I heard her voice slightly breathless saying, "I told her, Sophie is devastated in ways that matter, and I am sorry I was the cause of that. She has family there, and she needs them. I told her I would respect whatever space she needed. I am heading there now to finish some last things, but I wanted you to know. I could not wait. I do not expect anything except to be honest with you and with myself. See you soon." The sentence hung between us like a bridge under construction. It was wondrous and fragile and terrifying in the exact proportions I had spent months imagining. I did not sleep that night. I lay awake thinking of my 16-year-old self, that girl who thought a single touch was an earthquake. And I realized that nothing had really prepared me for the work that came after the earthquake, rebuilding without erasing what had been there before. When she arrived, it was not with the flush of someone who had leapt without thinking. She was hunched with a box of papers and a duffel bag, her eyes rimmed in exhaustion and something like resolve. We walked to the small coffee shop by my apartment, and she told me plainly that the conversation with Sophie had been painful, messy, and necessary. She was hurt in ways that were emphatically real. Chloe said, "She called me selfish. She called me foolish." She also asked for clarity, and I gave it. I did not do anything to lessen her pain. I did, however, offer the respect of an honest conversation. "Is she okay?" I asked. It was an impertinent, tender question. "She is okay," she said, and I could hear her thinking through the exactness of the phrase as if testing it for strength. "She is with her sister now. Olivia has been amazing." There was a small gratitude in her voice when she mentioned Sophie's sister. Gratitude that Sophie had a network around her. That support was available. "I cannot take away her pain," Chloe continued, "but I can try to be responsible for what I have caused." For a moment, the city street felt like a place where decisions could be measured in the distance between 2 coffee cups. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now I have to figure out what work looks like," she said, I need to be careful with my practice. I am not the kind of therapist who will leave without a plan. I have clients who need continuity. I need to set things up so they are not victims of my reckoning. I also have a lease and an apartment that is full of two people's things. There are conversations to have about stuff like who is taking what, about notices, and reality. Her practical list was like a tether to the ordinary world, and I loved her for it. She was not spinning the moment into romance. She was anchoring it in human terms. We walked back to my apartment, and in the smaller theater of the hallway, we kissed again. There was an urgency to it, and also a self-consciousness that felt like an admission. We were both aware of the aftermath. Afterward, she sat on the floor and took off her shoes and said, "I am frightened in a way that is new. Not scared of being with you necessarily. Scared of what it means to actually live in the consequences." "That is fair," I said. She looked up at me, and there it was, the open question in her eyes. "Are we doing this because it is the right thing, or because it is easy?" she asked. And I had to laugh because in its bluntness, it was honest. "It is not easy," I said. "It feels like the opposite of easy." She nodded, and the room seemed to breathe with us. She was not offering answers that night. She was offering presence and the work of being accountable. That oddly felt like the kind of love I could depend on. We lay down that night with the city's light bleeding across the curtains, a soft reminder that the world outside continued. I thought about Sophie and Olivia and the hurt we had caused, and a small, firm resolve settled in my chest. If this was to be something real, it would be built on taking responsibility and holding space for the people we hurt, not on a razor. Chloe, in claiming honesty over concealment, had started something that would require both courage and humility. I did not know the outcome, but for the first time in a long time, uncertainty felt like possibility rather than threat. A week later, she was back in Chicago doing what she said she would. Client handoffs, careful emails, a meeting with her supervisor to discuss the logistics of relocating a practice across state lines. I could hear it in her voice during our calls, the administrative rhythm of someone trying to do damage control with grace. She would send me lists of names and times and the occasional photo of a box being taped. "I cannot move until some of these things are in order," she said. "Some clients need 6 months of continuity. Some will be fine with a referral. I am trying to do this without wrecking anyone's support system." In the quiet of my apartment, I would watch the voicemail light blink and play her messages over and over. Each one contained something heavy and something hopeful. "I am doing the right thing by the people who need me," she said in one. "I need to be honest with myself," she said in another. In between, there were small, tender things. A photo of a bookstore shelf she thought I would like. A screenshot of a song lyric. A voice message of her laughing at something minor that had happened with a client. They were domestic breadcrumbs, tiny evidence that a life could be unmade and reassembled with care. And yet, there was a low, persistent fear in me. Was I a bomb or a wound? Was I a revival of something that would crack under the weight of adult consequence? Or could I be part of a slow, careful rebuilding? The questions roamed like stray dogs. Sometimes they came to the front of my mind in the supermarket aisle. Sometimes they showed up as dreams where all the furniture in our lives was made out of maps. She texted me once. "I told Sophie I wanted to try and make this honest and real. She deserves to know. She deserves time." And the message trailed off. And then finally, more decisively, "I will do this responsibly." Her methodical approach was a kind of morality play. She had chosen truth and was choosing the harder, kinder path, accounting for consequences and making choices that included those who might be hurt by them. I admired her for that, though there were times when admiration hurt because it meant keeping my own guard up and waiting for the real test. When we had to show that our love could survive the small, sometimes tedious work of merging two adult lives. As she worked on the logistics, we found ourselves in that peculiar limbo, intimate and distant at once. There were FaceTime dinners and late-night texts and promises to visit that took on a calendar of their own. Each visit was a test of how we would be when the novelty had to give way to the work of living. Would we be tender partners, or a story that looked good in dim light? One evening, months from that first reunion, but still in the bright beginning of things, she sent me a picture of a small Brooklyn practice, an office with plants and a desk, and a stacked volunteer sign-up sheet for a community workshop. She had been offered a connection in the area, a colleague willing to consult and help her transition her practice. The possibility that she might establish herself professionally near me, not because I asked, but because the opportunity aligned with what she valued, landed like a promise. She wrote in the message, "There is a slot. It means I could really try this, not as a fling or a fix, as a life." I read it 3 times and felt my throat tighten. It was dangerous to feel hope like that. But I had learned the past few months that certainty only arrived when you were willing to do the hard, ordinary thing of being present. She was choosing that labor piece by piece. A month later, she called and said, "I put in my notice." The sentence was simple and enormous. She explained the notice periods, the way therapy practices needed time to transfer care, the ethics of client continuity. She had arranged with her supervisor a transitional plan where she would continue to provide limited teletherapy for clients who needed time and had provided referrals for most. For high-risk clients, she had personally reached out to arrange a wrap-up plan with another clinician. It was not cinematic. It was responsible. It also cost her rent, a larger deposit for a new practice space. The social consequence of being the person who said, "I need to do something harder." She told me all this with a kind of quiet, fierce pride. "I am going to try," she said. "I do not know what will happen, but if I am going to be here, I am going to be completely here." I thought about Sophie in those days a lot. I tried to imagine her sitting with her sister, their small rituals of comfort, the practical splitting of things that once belonged to a shared life. Sometimes I tried to call Sophie and apologize for the pain that my presence caused, but I did not. It felt presumptuous to insert myself into that grief. Instead, I sent a message once, a line that simply said, "I recognize the hurt. I hope you have people around you." It was minimal and sincere, because that seemed the only language I had any right to use. From the outside, our story had the shape of something people like to romanticize: reunion, confession, flight to truth. But the life we were trying to make in the middle of it was domestic and inconvenient and full of spreadsheets and ethics. The romance was not a tidy bow, but a slow knot. We argued about practicalities, whose books would go on which shelf, how to split the cost of buying a second coffee machine, whether one of us would commute, or if both should bear the financial weight equally. We fought about small things that became metaphors for larger insecurities. Mornings when she left earlier than she had promised, and I felt abandoned. Or evenings when I snapped about dishes, and she took it as proof I was not invested. Those fights were the real test. They were not cinematic. They were blunt and ordinary. But they were also where trust was forged. We learned to be tender in the way people who love someone long-term are. Apologies came with action, not just words. We built rituals that were not glamorous. Sunday pancakes, the way she made coffee that was not quite like mine, but somehow tasted like home. The disparate spines of our books slowly becoming two together on a shelf. And still, even in the shallowness of ordinary days, the memory of the reunion of that photograph, the hand touch in a strobing flash of light, never quite left me. It had been more than an image. It was a pressure point from which our lives had pivoted. Sometimes I would stand in the kitchen and look at her across the counter and remember that gym full of string lights and feel gratitude braided with a little miserly guilt. For wanting what? For wanting what felt both inevitable and impossible, and how complicated desire could be when it arrived without asking for permission. There were days when gratitude braided with guilt so tightly that I could not tell which emotion I was feeling until later, when the thin, threadbare things of everyday life revealed them. The move-in day arrived like an overcast holiday. Chloe rented a moving truck the shade of hospital sky gray and showed up at my building with boxes stacked like a small city. Her hair was pulled back. There were creases at the corners of her eyes I had not noticed in photos. She carried a philodendron that took up half the passenger seat and a box labeled, "Books Do Not Judge." We turned the key to my apartment together and felt in that simple action like two people negotiating a public covenant. We spent the morning with the practical choreography of cohabitation, deciding which boxes to unpack first, where the toaster belonged, whether the extra set of sheets would live in the linen closet or the guest room that we still were not calling anything. The moving truck sagged empty in the street behind us like an exhale. She made tea in a way that was almost ceremonious. Loose leaves, a mug I had always favored, and we ate cold pizza on paper plates, which felt embarrassingly domestic in the most hopeful way. There were small negotiations that first week that felt disproportionately weighted. Where to hang the framed photograph I had taken in college. How to arrange the living room couch, which art would be rotated out. We laughed a lot. We also discovered preferences that felt like fingerprints. She never liked the thermostat above 68. I could not stand the kitchen tiles without a rug. These turned into the first of many conversations that would test both patience and goodwill. Our fights were never cinematic. They were about elbow room, about dishes left in the sink, as though the sink were a moral tribunal, about who remembered to replace the light bulb in the hall. One afternoon, a month after she arrived, we nearly came to blows over a stack of unpaid bills. She kept a spreadsheet for everything down to subscriptions, and her idea of financial transparency involved color-coded tabs and a level of granularity that made my head ache. I, who had never liked being beholden or having long-term forecasts, bristled. "You moved across a country," I said too sharply when she asked me to split the initial deposit for a new practice space she was scouting. "You uprooted your life for this." "I am not asking you to pay me back for sunsets, but we need a plan." She took a breath that made her shoulders lift and fall like a metronome. "I did not move because of you," she said. The sentence landed between us. I moved because I had been trying not to live with a lie. I am not here to be dependent on you. I wanted to make this possible myself, but I need to be realistic about the drain of starting over. It is not charity to plan this together. We argued in the way couples who hope to stay together argue. We tried to be fair with our words, but sometimes landed on the sharp edges of old defensiveness. After a week of stilted mornings and small silences, we sat on the fire escape with cheap wine and paper cups and hashed things out until we laughed at the ridiculousness of it. We made a new rule. When the anger was about money, we approached it like a puzzle to be solved rather than evidence of character failure. We wrote budgets on the back of receipts and taped them to the fridge like flossed teeth, unromantic and practical. There were also tender, almost ridiculous moments that felt like prophecies. One lazy Sunday, she stood in the doorway with an armful of my shirts she had put through the wash and remarked, "They smell like you." It was not a dramatic proposal. It was an ordinary observation that settled somewhere warm in my chest. We began to accumulate ritual. Sunday pancakes with a burned edge she preferred. A Friday night ritual of me reading aloud from whatever book I was halfway through. The way she left tiny post-its on my laptop with reminders and bad jokes. Sex, when it came, remained careful and consent-rich. We checked in with simple questions. "Are you okay with this?" That somehow made intimacy more honest, not less. It was surprising and ordinary both. Kisses that started at the kitchen counter. Hands that found each other's elbows during late-night conversations. The quiet laughter after an awkward misstep in bed. We were adults attempting to create patterns of generosity. At the same time, the past did not evaporate. Sophie was a shadow that sometimes showed up at the edge of transactions. An email that referenced an old landlord, a forwarded message from her sister asking for a doctor's contact. Once months into our cohabitation, I opened a package in the hallway and found a small potted succulent with a note from Sophie. For the apartment, Olivia, Sophie's sister, had been the steady presence through the breakup. Her practical kindness had a tone of weary tenderness. We left the plant on the kitchen windowsill. It felt like a truce between histories. We had moments when Sophie's anger and grief were placed directly in front of us. A week after Chloe moved out of their Chicago apartment, Sophie drove in with Olivia and a car full of boxes to retrieve the things that were hers. A framed photograph of their first trip together, a stack of records, a potted fern that did not belong to anyone now. Olivia was efficient in a way that demanded boundaries. Sophie's face was pale in a way that made me want to fix everything by proxy. We had agreed, after a tense text exchange, careful, adult, human, that Chloe would be present for the visit if Sophie wanted it. They met at a neutral cafe rather than the apartment because Sophie's sister insisted on it. When Sophie walked in, there was a kind of extraordinariness to seeing her up close. She looked smaller in daylight and larger in the memory of accusation that had hovered around her for months. She sat stiffly, and Chloe sat opposite with her hands folded, an apology physically present in the way her shoulders curved inward. "I do not think I can ever say it was okay," Sophie said at one point, her voice a reservoir. "But I do think you are trying to be honest." There was no rage in the sentence, just fatigue and a mournful sort of clarity. "I will be fine," she added, not as a bravado, but as an assertion of survival. "It will take time." She thanked me once, oddly for a message I had sent months earlier where I had acknowledged the hurt. "It was brave of you to say that," she told me. I did not know whether it was to me or to the fact of our conversation, but the gratitude landed like rain on dry soil. That meeting did not erase anything. It did not provide narrative neatness, but it did make the landscape less treacherous. Sophie's sorrow was real. Her life continued. Chloe's responsibility for the wound remained. Work for both of us required adaptation. I, who traveled less frequently than before, but still kept consulting clients, learned to negotiate the hours around her intake meetings and community workshops. She accepted a position at a small group practice in Brooklyn, an arrangement brokered by the colleague she had met months earlier. It was not glamorous. It was an opportunity to rebuild a client base with ethical continuity. She commuted for a while, balancing teletherapy and in-person sessions, gradually converting clients who could tolerably receive care across time zones, training staff, offering introductions, arranging a referral network. It was the sort of labor that no one wrote novels about, but it steadied her, and by extension us. We argued again, inevitably, about the feel of domestic sacrifice. Once in a particularly raw exchange after a long week where a client crisis had pulled her into the clinic late and I had prepared dinner alone, I said, "It feels like I am carrying the emotional labor of keeping the home right now, while you carry the labor of dissolving a life." It came out jagged, not as accusation, but as a plea for recognition. She looked at me, the light catching her cheekbones, and said, "I know this looks uneven. I am trying to make it not be that way. I am trying to find work that is sustainable. I am paying for the deposit on the practice space, and I agreed to the shared accounts. I am trying." Her voice held fatigue, but also an insistence I respected. We took a breath and then made a plan, literally a plan written on a notepad with columns of chores, days blocked for uninterrupted work, and a weekly budget review. We did not resolve everything. No single agreement could retroactively make the past less painful, but we created a framework to distribute the weight. There were moments of tenderness in the midst of all of it. On a rainy Tuesday, we stood in a bookstore and argued quietly about which edition of Virginia Woolf to buy. She insisted on the library edition and I on the portable. We left with both and found our way back to the fire escape, where we read aloud to each other until the rain stopped and the city smelled like wet asphalt and possibility. That night, she played me a voicemail from a client she had transferred gently, someone who had thanked her for the respect shown during the handoff. "It matters," she said, tapping her phone. "The tiny acts matter." The midpoint of our slow burn came not as a single cinematic crescendo, but as a gradation of small certainties. She had a lease in the neighborhood, a handful of committed clients who trusted her teletherapy, and a colleague who offered to consult for her first 6 months. It was not everything, but it was enough to tilt the ledger toward plausibility. We celebrated by making eggplant lasagna together. Messy, slow, full of burnt cheese and drinking cheap champagne in chipped glasses. "To trying," she said, and I clinked my glass against hers. Despite the forward motion, patterns from the past occasionally reared up like invasive plants. There were nights when she withdrew into a shape I had seen before, the careful distancing that preceded a retreat. Once, after a curt phone call with a former Chicago client who required an intensive transition plan, she shut down and left me standing on the sofa like a tableau. "You are shutting me out," I said more harshly than necessary. She turned, face soft with exhaustion. "I am trying not to detach the way I did before," she said. "This is me trying not to vanish." Her voice broke as if those words were a memory that hurt to touch. We both sat on the edge of what might be a rupture and chose separately to step back into the conversation rather than away from it. We scheduled a weekend away in a nearby town, not to run from problems, but as a friend suggested, and to simply be near each other without the office or the apartment as a third presence. On that weekend, we spoke like architects of a future home. Boundaries about work hours, agreements about finances, the way we would approach conflict when one person felt vulnerable. We made a pact, humble and domestic, that neither of us would end an argument by walking out of the apartment without a concrete plan to reconcile. It sounded small. It felt monumental. The professional breakthrough came on a Thursday morning when she sat at the kitchen counter with a letter clutched to her palm and a smile that was part nerve and part relief. A small collaborative practice in Brooklyn, the very one she had been prospecting, had offered her an associate position with a pathway to partnership contingent on client retention and participation in their community outreach. It was not the grand gesture of a fantasy career, but it was real. Legitimate income projections, a modest health plan, a rentable consultation room. More important, it signaled a willingness on someone else's part to stake their trust in her capacity to do this vulnerable work anew. "It means I can be here longer than months," she said, voice wobbling with emotion. "It means I am not a guest. It means I have an anchor." We celebrated quietly with a meal from the restaurant down the street and music that was slightly too loud for our small kitchen. Afterwards, with dishes between us like small broken moons, she reached across the sink, took my hand, and said, "I love you." It was not the cinematic first declaration we had both imagined in teenage dreams. It was older, softer, the sentence of someone who had done her accounting and decided to keep going. Anyway, I felt a hot, immediate answer rise in my chest. I said, "I love you too." And it felt less like a performance and more like a homecoming. We both cried a little, then absurdly over the washing up water. Saying "I love you" did not end our problems. It added a weight of accountability to them. There were still fights about mornings and dishes, and who would take care of the philodendron when one of us traveled. There were still nights when either of us woke with the old animal ache of insecurity. But the confessions changed the tenor of the repair. Apologies were matched with changes. If one of us left a pile of laundry, the apology came with an offer to fold it together. If one of us snapped in stress, the other would ask, "Do you want to talk about what you need in this moment?" We practiced a politics of small kindnesses that gradually remapped our expectations. We also chose to create a ritual of public witness, not to prove anything to others, but to affirm to ourselves that our relationship existed beyond private apology. We invited close friends for a dinner one spring to meet the version of ourselves that was less cloistered and more mundane. Chloe showed up with a bag of pastries. I poured wine clumsily. Olivia came cautiously friendly, and Sophie herself sent a short message wishing us well and saying she appreciated the time to recenter. It was not a reconciliation scene from a movie. It was a cautious adult conversation over hummus. The room's ordinary light made us look like people who might improbably manage. In the months that followed, our days settled into a rhythm that felt domestic and small in the way that lasts. Saturday mornings, with the newspaper, shared playlists, the way she insisted on buying 2 kinds of olives, though I liked only one. We argued about calendars and then laughed at the ridiculousness of double-booked dinners. We learned the exact timing of each other's gestures, the little hum she made when concentrating. The way I reached for the radio dial when a certain song came on, both of us telegraphing an unspoken language of the home. The sex was less urgent and more inventive. Shared showers, handholds across the bed, sleeping in spooned heat. Our apartment's bookshelves slowly integrated one another's authors, a physical record of how we were becoming fluent in the same literary dialect. The hardest days remained those when the past knocked on the door. There were times when Sophie would call, or a forwarded email would mention something Chloe and she had planned years ago, or we would receive a tax form with both our names from an old lease. Those things landed like stray stones. We learned to talk through them without collapsing into blame. Chloe continued to treat her sense of guilt with the gravity it deserved, answering Sophie's texts with a kindness that sometimes looked like penance and sometimes like refuge. Sophie, for her part, survived. She dated people. She had therapy with a clinician not connected to our social web. She and Olivia hosted small dinners again. I never stopped feeling a sliver of empathy for what she had lost. With some nights I would wake up and feel it as a hollow ache, like a bruise that had not been allowed to fully heal. We did something else that mattered, and that felt privately like progress. We commuted back to Chicago for Sophie's birthday and met up in a neutral public garden. It was awkward, tender, and exact. Sophie brought a potato salad in a plastic bowl and a stack of Polaroids of the apartment before the breakup. We exchanged finalities at first: how the city treated us, what we had been eating, which friends had settled down. Then Sophie said something that surprised me. "I do not want to be the story you tell when I leave the room." She said, "I want to be the woman who loved and who was loved, even if we did not end up where we thought. I do not want you to feel like you have to erase me to move forward." It was such a generous sentence that I choked on it for a second. Sophie's grief remained. She was entitled to it and to its space, but she had also carved out a life that contained resilience and a future. We left that afternoon with a fragile, honest truce that did not solve the past, but made living beside one another possible. The economic realities of two people in one apartment required continued negotiation. We signed up for an automatic split on certain bills. We opened a joint savings for shared purchases, but kept separate accounts for individual needs. We argued about the thermostat still, and I insisted on dark curtains to keep summer heat at bay. She insisted on more plants in the kitchen. These small compromises, I realized, were the scaffolding of trust. They required consistency rather than apologies. They required days in which both of us did the dull work. There were also days of immense gratitude. A project of mine that I had been wobbly about won a long-shot client, and I came home and she had the lights dimmed and a bottle of wine open. She sat me down on the couch and said, "You did this. You earned this." The way she said it, pride without condescension, felt like the kind of witness I had craved for years. We lived through petty indignities, lost keys, forgotten meetings, a burst pipe in winter, and through better things. Finding a farmer's market stall that sold the heirloom tomatoes she liked. A neighborhood dog who ran to greet us. We learned the fine art of small corrections. "When you say it like that, I feel dismissed," I would say sometimes. And she would nod and try another phrasing. "I need 5 minutes before I can talk," she would tell me, and I would stop trying to force an answer. Our fights reduced in frequency and increased in clarity. We started interrupting each other less and listening more, and the difference between speaking and being heard became embarrassingly a miracle. There was the public stuff too. The novelty of being a couple in certain social circles required some adjustment. Friends would ask how we met in a tone that expected a small, tidy narrative. The truth felt less cinematic than we would both like. Two adults who decided imperfectly and with real cost to be together. We told our story without glossing over the parts that hurt. People listened and sometimes asked difficult questions about Sophie, about ethics, about whether our love had been worth the consequences. We did not have to answer for everyone. We answered for ourselves. The years, or what felt like years, wended past in the particular speed of ordinary life. Tax seasons, birthdays, a sick cat that we adopted impulsively from a neighbor who could not keep her, a bookshelf that finally had our combined collection of poetry. We continued therapy individually. We tried couples therapy for a season, not to fix anything, but to learn new skills for arguing without collapsing into old pains. It was helpful sometimes, useless at others. The therapist gave us phrases and techniques that we used and abandoned depending on what the moment needed. Therapy did not make everything smooth. It made us more reflective and less likely to flail at each other when tired. A defining moment arrived on an otherwise trivial evening. She had been offered a chance to lead a community workshop in Brooklyn about trustworthy therapy practices, part of the Small Practices Outreach mission. It was an unpaid gig, but the kind of project that long-term would build her presence and integrate her into the local network. She was nervous. I was proud in a way that felt almost physical. After the workshop, attendees came up to her asking about referrals, about her technique, and one offered to connect her with a group clinic that worked with adolescents. It was not sudden fame. It was steady, slow validation. We celebrated with our usual imperfect fireworks, cheap champagne, and an overcooked thing of pasta. The kind of laughter that made the walls of our apartment feel less like boundaries and more like shelter. That night, the way she looked at me as we washed the plates, water streaming, hands touching in the dishwater, was the kind of look that contained 100 small promises. She squeezed my hand and said, "I am in this, not as a guest, not as a visitor. I mean to be here," in the way lovers sometimes measure commitment by the tempo of daily things rather than singular speeches. That sentence was everything. We said "I love you" many times after that, not as a rehearsed line, but as a practice, a punctuation in the quieter moments that marked our joint life. We never ceased to be attentive to the ethical residue of our beginning. There were anniversaries of the breakup we recognized privately. A quiet bouquet left on Sophie's birthday, with a note from Olivia acknowledging that the day might be complicated. A small donation made to a mutual friend's fundraiser that had once been something both Chloe and Sophie supported. Chloe continued to be pragmatic about contact with Sophie, offering updates only when it felt appropriate and always with regard for Sophie's privacy. There was an ongoing dance of accountability and autonomy. One particular Sunday cemented for me the sense that the reunion had become something like revival. We had spent the day fixing up a little reading nook in the bedroom, arranging pillows and a thrift store lamp. The city outside hum was a steady bass note. She made tea and sat on the window seat, and we read aloud to one another. At some point, between a paragraph about a woman leaving home and a description of a river, she reached out and touched my face as if testing the terrain of my features and said quietly, "I want this to be the life we chose, not a life we landed in." I looked at her and said, "It is the life we chose." It felt true. We had chosen, often awkwardly, sometimes with false starts, but we had chosen. The admission felt less like an exclamation than a settled fact. There were still imperfections. Once in the middle of a hectic period at work for both of us, we had a blowout that was less about the dishes than about a fear of abandonment. I accused her of making plans that never included me. She accused me of being too reactive and of expecting constant reassurance. The fight lasted until dawn, a series of truth darts and clumsy apologies. The repair came slowly, a note left on the pillow. A small repair of an overlooked plant, a scheduling of a date night that neither of us canceled. Over time, these little acts accumulated into the trust we needed. In the end, the reunion that had been at first a single image, her hand touching mine in a flash of reunion, had turned into a long, stubborn life. It had been messy and practical and full of grief sometimes. It had required the humility of apologies made without expectation, the patience to let someone change careers, the discipline of being responsible not just to each other, but to the people our choices touched. It had also contained tenderness that could not be fabricated. The way she draped a blanket over my knees while I typed late at night. The way I would leave little notes in her lunchbox when I had to travel. The ritual of folding laundry side by side like monks in a quiet monastery. We marked our first full year together with a small dinner that I cooked and a playlist she made. We invited a few friends, and Olivia came again, this time with a real smile that felt like permission. Sophie did not attend, and there was not a need for her to. She had her life, and we had ours, and we honored both. After guests left, we sat on the couch and watched a movie neither of us paid full attention to, more interested in the warmth of the other's knee against our own. When the credits rolled, Chloe turned to me and said softly, I think this is work that I can stay in for the long haul. It is not a blaze. It is a kind of slow, good burn. She squeezed my hand. I want to build here with you. I nodded. I had my own work that felt less itinerant now. Projects that allowed me to stay in one city more often. Clients who trusted the steadiness I had brought. We had negotiated careers and compromised, and still, the shape of our days left room for both of us to grow. There was no guarantee that everything would stay the same. There were no fairy tale certainties, but there was a readiness between us to face the imperfect future together. On a night that felt like any other, with the apartment lit by lamplight and the street below whispering, she leaned forward and kissed me. Not to resolve anything or to stave off a crisis, but as an ongoing promise to continue showing up. "Will you marry me?" she asked quietly with a laugh that was half serious and half afraid. I laughed too, because it was both ridiculous and wonderful. "Yes," I said honestly, meaning that I wanted the ordinary work of being married. Tax forms, shared responsibilities, the legal entanglement of a life made public. I wanted to choose her every morning with the kind of small gesture that had become our liturgy. "Yes," I said again, not as a capstone, but as a continuation. She reached for the stack of mismatched mugs, took two, and held them out like a covenant. I took one, and we drank tea until it got cold, and the world outside sounded like a place that could be weathered. The reunion that had started with the photographer's flash and a handbrush had not been a tidy circle. It had opened wounds and required honest repair. It had cost people things and also given them room to grow. It had asked us to be responsible professionally, ethically, emotionally for the consequences of our choices. It had taught us that love is not a rescue from the past, but a series of careful, often mundane acts that build something more resilient than the heat of a single moment. Sometimes, when the city was quiet and one of us was up early, we would stand on the fire escape and watch the light change over the river. We would hold hands without saying anything, simply knowing how the other liked their coffee, how the other fidgeted when nervous, where the soft spot was behind the left ear. Those small intimacies felt like a language only we spoke. I think of that night at the reunion sometimes, the flash of light, the pressure between our palms, and realize that what mattered most was not that she was not alone in the room then, but that we had later chosen to be together in a way that acknowledged everyone affected by that choice. It had taken courage to be honest and patience to heal, when it had required us to trade the safety of silence for the harder elasticity of truth. We were and remain imperfect, but determined. We were not the people we had been at 16. We were people who had learned how to say sorry and how to listen, how to move through the small domestic tides without letting them define us. We had learned that commitment is often built in the tedium, the shared purchase of a vacuum cleaner, the decision to keep two sets of keys, the way one of us would wake to the other's nightmare and hold them until the breathing evened. So if the reunion image is the memory people remember, know this: the photo was only the beginning. The real story unfolded in the slow acceptance of weekdays and in the quiet moments where two women decided again and again to remain present. We did not erase the people who were hurt in the process. We carried their names with the care we hoped they deserved. We did the work. We learned how to live with consequence and with gratitude. If this story reached you in some small way, if it made you think about how messy and honest love can be, please like, share, and subscribe for more stories like this.